From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. Here's what's ahead. K-State's Romulo Lollato will take a look at how the recent weather conditions around Kansas have impacted the winter wheat crop's ability to harden off for the winter, especially considering that so many wheat stands have emerged late because of the delayed planting this fall. Then K-State's Jonathan Aguilar will talk about a new research grant awarded by the NRCS to K-State's Water Tech Farms project to further study the pros and cons of mobile drip irrigation systems as an alternative to center pivot sprinkler irrigation. And later, K-State's Charlie Lee will talk about the biological and ecological forces that cause deer to be on the move at this time of the year. All that and more next on Agriculture Today.
Did you know every Kansas farmer feeds 128 plus people?
Kansas farmers are hard workers, dependable, authentic, and sensitive.
Not only do farmers put food on your table, but they put clothes on your back and fuel in your car.
For more information about Kansas farmers, visit K-State Research and Extension online or stop by your local extension office. This message has been brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
With our recent weather patterns around Kansas, some questions have cropped up now about the status of the Kansas winter wheat crop. Whether or not these drier conditions are taking a toll, whether or not that crop is hardening off sufficiently for the upcoming harsher winter weather, those items and more right here. With Romulo Lollato, Mike's side once again. Romulo, as you well know, is a wheat production specialist with K-State Research and Extension. And Romulo, you've been in conversation with K-State specialists, county extension agents out there of late, and getting your own sense of what's happening with our wheat. And there are some distinct concerns, are there not?
Hi, Eric. Yeah, as well, there definitely are some concerns, and some of them, as you mentioned, include is the wheat hardening enough for the winter, and the other one is how dry are we, and are we starting to see the crop kind of go backwards. And I think for us to discuss some of those things, we can kind of look back on how we were at planting time. With all that rain that we had from late September through about mid-October, we were delayed in planting, right? So at one point in time, mid-October, where the Kansas crop is generally about 70 or more percent planted, we were about 40. So at one point in time, mid-October, we were really behind. As of now, we kind of caught up and we're back to close to 100% planted in the state, which is normal for this time of the year. But there is that part of the state that, that part of October that we didn't get almost anything planted that first 2 weeks of October. So we were getting the crop in the ground slightly later than what we would like to, right? And right after we planted, we had almost a month, actually, of colder temperatures. We started planting the crop by mid-October, that we really started to increase the pace, and then cold temperatures came down. So the crop emerged, and it's slowly developing, but it's important for us to remember that those cold temperatures, they are going to delay crop development. Right? We might not put as many tillers as we would like going into the winter. So those are a couple of things that we're concerned with. Is first, we were delayed. The crop is less developed because of those cold temperatures. So maybe right now we have fields that were planted in mid-October or in that late part of October, when if we had normal temperatures, we could be close to that third or fourth tiller, and we're actually seeing just now that first tiller come out.
So that could be a serious consequence for that stand, could it not?
Definitely could, Eric, because if we think of the winter hardiness, it's preferred if we have maybe 3 to 5 well-formed tillers in the fall. We don't need many tillers, we don't need much biomass out there, because we can run into water deficit issues later on. But having those minimum of 3 to 5 well-formed tillers will help with cold acclimation, with the crop becoming more winter hardy. If we have only one, we might have enough resources in that plant, but it is risky, right? We would be in a better shape if we had more tillers out. Another thing that is important for us to think whenever we have the late planting is that we can also have a decreased yield potential. Right? If we're planting late, we generally have less time to produce fall tillers, which are more productive. So we're going to have actually probably less yield potential We're also going to be delaying the crop cycle. So generally, instead of heading maybe early May, we might be heading May 10th, depending on where you are in the state, of course. But if we look back at some research that was done by Merle Wheat in Garden City, and he had 6 years of data that he was looking at delayed planting, just by planting in November 1st as compared to October 1st, so that 1 month delay in planting decreased yields in about 23% over these 6 years of research, and delayed heading in about 6 days. So if we're delaying heading, we're going to be filling the grain during a warmer temperature, and that can also hit our yields. If we think of it, the warmer the temperatures are during grain filling, less starch the crop is going to put in the grain. And so we can see a new decrease because of that delayed cycle as well. Actually, his work showed that grain filling was happening at about close to 2 degrees Fahrenheit warmer temperatures just by delaying the planting like that. And it was shorter. It was close to about 3 days shorter grain filling period. So, I mean, pretty clear that as we're delaying, as we saw this year, we're probably putting our crop into grain filling into warmer conditions.
So once that crop gets behind, so to speak, it's very difficult in the absence of ideal conditions for it to catch up in terms of eventual productivity. Is that accurate?
That's accurate, yes. And if we see what happened last year, in many cases we didn't have much of a fall stand, but conditions were really good in the spring and the yields were still pretty good. Mm-hmm. So as you mentioned, if we have ideal conditions in the spring, we might see no yield decrease at all. Now, if conditions are harsh, we might expect a harder yield hit in our crop.
The other part of the question that we want to bring up today is, beyond the tillering level of that stand, will it be in a situation where it can properly harden off? And tillering is part of that equation, but there are several other contributors to that, correct?
Definitely, Eric. So there are other important factors there that we need to consider. So let's try to just understand what goes on within the plant in that cold acclimation. As temperatures start to go down in the fall, and as we have shorter days in the fall, that triggers the plant to produce a substance that is almost an antifreeze substance. It's called proline, and that substance, the greater the concentration that we have of it, especially in the crown level, the better the chances our wheat crop has to make it through the winter, the better cold acclimation it will have. And really, for us to start getting into that point, the crop needs anywhere from 4 to 6 weeks of temperatures in the crown level below about 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, if we look at the temperatures at the 2-inch across the state, so the Kansas Maisonette has that product available. If we look at that 2-inch temperature across the state, for a lot of the state, we were averaging well below 50, especially if we look at north central Kansas into western Kansas. Temperatures were already triggering that cold acclimation process these last few weeks. Now, that process, it's not really static. Once it starts getting into the dormancy, it's going to be there. No, temperatures were going up and down, and this process actually, the crop starts to be more cold acclimated, and it will grow some more as well whenever we have temperatures, whenever it allows, so it decreases its cold hardness, and so on. But once the crop reaches its maximum cold hardness, generally by the winter, as long as the crown level temperature remains below or about 32 Fahrenheit or so, the crop will stay dormant through the winter. We might still see, if we don't have a frozen soil, we might still see some root growth happening during the winter. For the majority, it will stay dormant through the winter as long as crown level temperatures are at that 32 or so. So looking back at these last few weeks, we definitely had temperatures cold enough to start that cold acclimation process. So the crop should be going into that. Now, hopefully, with this next couple weeks or so, that we still have an above-average temperature forecast, we might still put a few tillers out before the crop actually gets to that state of cold dormancy. Another thing that is important for us to consider in winter hardness now is root development.
And that may be lacking in some places.
That may be lacking, yes. We have been pretty dry. Actually, for the majority of the wheat-growing region in the state, central Kansas into western Kansas, we haven't really had significant precipitation the last month. So for over 30 days, we haven't really had significant precipitation. That can restrict some of our root growth, and it's important for us to remember that while we want to protect is the crown, that's generally placed about, maybe about 1 inch below the soil surface. And if we have a good secondary root development, or the reason I brought the crown up here is that they are also called crown roots, is that they will help the crop make it through the winter. They will help the crop keep uptaking some water and some nutrients and make it through the winter. So make sure that the crop has those reserves once it gets on the spring to retake on spring growth.
Main thing, producers need to be alert to the fact that we're not as bad off, basically, as we were last fall when it was ultra dry across the state. But by the same token, there are factors out there potentially at work that could raise questions about the ultimate productivity of this crop. Producers need to monitor their conditions fairly closely, don't they?
Yes, I think probably the biggest concern that we have at this point is that we have dry soils now. And those dry soils, they will buffer less any change in temperatures. So, in other words, the soils will become colder if the weather is cold, or they will become hotter if the weather is warm, faster as compared to a moist soil. And I'm talking specifically about the topsoil. Probably we have good subsoil moisture in many parts of the state, but the topsoil is dry because we haven't had significant precipitation in a month. So, a dry soil will expose the crop more to cold winter. So if you have a cold temperatures now, the crop will be more exposed for having that dry topsoil. So that's one thing that probably the biggest concern at this point that we need to keep in mind. Probably some precipitation, some rainfall will definitely be very helpful at this point to help both increase some of the tillering now in the fall and to help buffer some of those temperature changes.
Romulo, we appreciate this update. Many thanks to you. Enjoy your Thanksgiving.
Thank you very much, Eric. And just as a reminder there, the producers can also find these on my either Facebook or Twitter accounts, which both are at KSU Wheat.
Romulo Lollato sharing those thoughts on our wheat crop conditions at present. He's a wheat production specialist with K-State Research and Extension. You're listening to Agriculture Today. Agricultural producers, landowners, and creditors, you have a partner in your legal and financial needs. Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services offers reliable, trusted information and guidance. Whether you need advice for ag credit concerns or are transitioning your operation to the next owner, Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services can assist you in making sound decisions for your business. To learn more, call 800-321-3276 or visit us online. You're listening to the K-State Radio Network. This is Agriculture Today. As you will recall from previous broadcasts, Kansas State University has a research initiative going on in the western part of the state that is evaluating new crop irrigation technology, specifically the mobile drip irrigation system. Well, with that in mind, K-State has just received a new grant from the Natural Resources Conservation Service to support that work further, and we're going to talk of what will be done here under the auspices of this grant. Along with us once again is Water Resources Engineer with K-State Research and Extension, Jonathan Aguilar. Jonathan, let's first off go back to the origins of this work and what you have been doing to date with mobile drip irrigation, explaining the concept, first of all.
Yes, I think I usually start this conversation on the mobile drip irrigation because it started with a question from the producers themselves. One winter time, we invite all of the producers, representative producers within our area in each county, and we ask them, what research focus should we be looking at this year or the next coming years? And it was around 2015 that they came out with all of these questions regarding the mobile drip irrigations. And we held up our hands and said, hey, wait, we don't have those answers yet because we are not looking at it. And so thereon, we tried to look for partners. We look for supporters, sponsors to be able to answer those real questions from the producers. And that was actually very educational for us because having the farmers themselves ask those questions and us partnering with them and writing the proposals, that has more meaning for the funders or for the other agencies that are looking also to answer those farmer-based questions. And so for the past couple of years, we have partnered with the Kansas Water Office and several of the other private and public entities are, in the western area to come up with this water technology farm. So we are moving our research in our station where the farmers are doing it per se in their farm, so large scale. So we are putting them out so that, one, we could know more about the management of this particular technology, and at the same time allow other producers to see it firsthand in their neighborhood if it is really working. And so we've been doing this for a couple of years, but we need some help to be able to really answer some more in-depth questions about this technology. For example, the economics of it. Mm-hmm. For example, how do you integrate that with the scheduling? We have come up with some of the tools like the CanSched for irrigation scheduling, but this is not yet part of those options that they could use. And also the management per se. What are the management issues, the challenges, and the advantages? These are the things that, together with NRCS, they were also interested about those questions. Mm-hmm. And so we were able to be fortunate this year to get a national grant from the Conservation Innovation Grant. We call it the CIG, or the Conservation Innovation Grant. And they allowed us to move further with these water technology farms and answer those more specific questions. So we were fortunate to have a team, and we were able to write a proposal that jives with some of the questions that they have in themselves.
The grant, just for the record, amounts to just over $672,000 in support of this work. Mobile irrigation, we might physically define what it is. It's basically a dragline system through a field, which could be integrated into a center pivot system. Is that correct?
That is right. So in our western part of the world, there's a lot of center pivot, but we know that is not the best that is out there. We still have the subsurface drip irrigation, which utilizes the drip tapes, just applying the water on in a drip mode. So we try to marry this drip technology with the center pivot that are very practical and very abundant in our area, and hopefully we could capitalize on the efficiency of the drip. So that's why we call it the mobile drip irrigation, because it's a drip line that is moving, so it's mobile.
But like you said, your objective from here forward is to look at such things as what it actually takes to successfully convert from center pivot to this merger, if you will, of center pivot and mobile drip irrigation.
That is right. So from NRCS point of view, if they are going to consider this as a new technology in their suite of tools producers could use, they need some guidance. One is, how really efficient is the system? Second would be, is there really a way for them to really manage this particular system such that it will be successful for the farmer's point of view? Or if there are challenges, they could warn them, or they could give them some guidance as to how to overcome these challenges that they are going to encounter when they try to change from a fully center pivot system to a mobile drip irrigation system. Mm-hmm. So those are the things that we would like to give the NRCS at the end of this project, and more so also the economics itself. I know that many producers out there are always looking several years in the future, and at the same time they're looking at the cost benefit, the economics of this particular system. It's not a cheap system, and so they would like to know if this system is going to have an income at the end, of the benefit that they could get from this particular system. So we would like to get some of those guys in, and I think as the university itself, we are on the right footing here to be able to develop those information for them.
And that benefit would come in the form of water savings compared to the cost of the system without interfering or hampering crop productivity in any way.
That is right, because even though we would like to reduce the water use, we know that farming is still a business in one way or another, and so we would not like to hamper the productivity and the business aspect of the farm.
And Jonathan, you mentioned trying to apply irrigation scheduling principles to mobile drip irrigation. Is that a tall task? Is that a challenge? It
becomes a tall task because, first of all, we we still get some rain in our part of the state. And if we get that rain, it's free water. And we would like to at least give the producers an opportunity to shut off the system, save that water, and probably reduce any runoff in the field. Scheduling with this mobile drip irrigation is a little bit tricky because we haven't had this system before. We only have center pivot before, and we only have subsurface drip irrigation. But we know that it is somewhere in between. So if we say that center pivot are around 85% efficient and subsurface drip is about 95% efficient, the mobile drip irrigation is somewhere in between. And so we would like to nail down what is really the efficiency of the system. And in order to do that, we should conduct some research on farm and on the station itself. And at the same time, be able to integrate this with scheduling. We know that if you apply water on a field, not all of the water are going to be on the soil itself. And so with the efficiency part, we could at least estimate what's really getting into the soil and what's really being lost by the system.
By the sound of it, you'll be collecting a colossal amount of data.
Yes.
That's the intent anyway.
That is right. And so we've got the 3 years to be able to collect all those data. And yes, we will be in the field many days of the week throughout this growing season and the next 3 years.
And you'll have this at the station itself, the research station there that K-State maintains in southwest Kansas, but these water tech farms as well. And how many of those are there now?
So right now there are 5 that are being monitored by K-State in our part of the world, but we would still also be adding a couple more on-farm research, focusing more on this particular project that we have. But the producers are great to work with because they have opened up their field towards this kind of research, and we are able to do large-scale monitoring of the system rather than using our small plots in the research station. And I guess that's a good complement between the research that we have, wherein we have a better control in our research plots, which is great. But at the same time, there are some management issues that are only going to emerge if it is going to be a large-scale operation.
You're getting a real-world perspective.
That is right.
On this. Looking forward to hearing what results emerge from this work over the next 3 years. You've already accumulated quite some information on mobile drip irrigation systems, so you're simply going to add to what is already pulled together at K-State. This is a very big deal for you and your colleagues. So
it is a very big deal because now we have the eyes of the whole country because this is a National Conservation Innovation Grant. Mm-hmm. We have the eyes of the whole country looking at us, trying to hone this particular technology and hone the information that we get to the producers.
Once again, good luck with this work as it starts to unfold here, starting in 2018 and the next years thereafter. And thanks for briefing us on what's happened here, Jonathan.
Thank you very much also for this opportunity.
He is Jonathan Aguilar. He's a K-State Water Resources Engineer, and once again, Kansas State University, Jonathan and his team specifically, just receiving a grant from the Natural Resources Conservation Service under its Conservation Innovation Grants Program, $672,000 to support further exploration of the mobile drip irrigation systems and how applicable those might be as an irrigation alternative for crop production in western Kansas. You're listening to Agriculture Today, and more is coming your way after this break over the K-State Radio Network.
Hamburgers, roast, ribs, steak, or whatever you prefer. Beef, it's what's for dinner. Kansas cattle farmers produce 7.5 million head of cattle per year. It takes about 7 tablespoons of peanut butter to get the same amount of protein in 1 serving of lean beef. Support your local Kansas farmers and ranchers. Eat beef. This message was brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
Broadcasting from the campus of Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Welcome back. Eric Atkinson here. Now, a couple of the day's lead stories in agricultural news for you, starting with the crop condition update out of the USDA for the week ending this past Sunday in Kansas. Our topsoil moisture supplies were rated at 2% surplus, 68% adequate, and 25% short to very short. The subsoil moisture at 1% surplus, 70% adequate, and 29% short to very short now. The condition of the winter wheat crop in the state, according to the USDA, 56% good to excellent, 32% fair, and 12% poor to very poor. The winter wheat emergence is at 90%. That's behind the 95% average for the date. Corn harvest, 96% complete, very near average. Soybean harvest is at 94% done, again near the average. And the grain sorghum harvest in Kansas, 86% complete. That is somewhat behind the average of 92% for the date. Nationally, with 88% of the crop emerged as of Sunday, the USDA is estimating that 52% of the nation's winter wheat crop is in good to excellent condition. That's down slightly from 54% the previous week. Corn harvest continuing to lag slightly behind the average pace, the USDA estimating that 90% of corn is harvested, and that's below the 5-year average of 95%. The soybean harvest nearing completion, 96% harvested as of Sunday, down from the 5-year average of 97%, and grain sorghum nationally 90% harvested, slightly behind the 5-year average of 92% in this week's account from the USDA. And Tyson Foods announced yesterday that it will be building a new chicken production complex near Humboldt, Tennessee, located in the western part of that state. The $300 million project is expected to create more than 1,500 local jobs once the new complex begins operations in 2019. The company's original plan was to build a facility in Leavenworth County, south of Tonganoxie, here in Kansas. After that announcement, it was met with resistance from some residents of the area and outside groups opposed to having the facility in that area. Then in late September, Leavenworth County commissioners pulled the proposed funding to help build Tyson Foods' proposed facility. Then the company decided to pull back on that location, started considering other locations in the state as well as other states. Tyson has reportedly still narrowed a search in Kansas to build a facility in Sedgwick, Cloud, and Montgomery counties. This recent announcement on the facility in Tennessee will not affect their decision of building a poultry facility in Kansas. The Kansas Department of Agriculture released an official statement saying that it will continue to work with Tyson as they further evaluate the expansion of their poultry business growth opportunities here in Kansas. Now it's on to this week's edition of Milk Lines. Awaiting with that is K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk. Mike?
Today I'd like to visit with our Kansas dairy producers concerning the use of milk for selected dairy products and the consumption of those products here in the United States. You know, as we look at our current situation in the milk market, many of us are concerned about where we're at with price that we're receiving on farm. So sometimes it's maybe important to take a step back and look at how is that raw milk that you're producing today, how will it actually be used or consumed in the U.S. dairy market. A lot of our focus in the past few years has been on exports, but maybe we need to turn our thoughts more internally and look to see what's going on here in the United States. So, as you look at the broad picture, really, dairy consumption and dairy products here in the U.S. that we utilize are really divided into two main groups. One would be fluid milk, the other would be cheeses. Those really do represent a huge percentage of the total consumption of dairy here in the United States. As we've had for the last several decades, fluid milk consumption on a per capita basis continues to decline. Although if you look at the total amount of milk consumed as fluid milk, that has actually been fairly steady. It's just with more people in the United States, a steady consumption in terms of pounds each year leads to a lower per capita consumption. However, the bright spot is what happens with cheeses. Cheese consumption has really grown in the last couple of decades and continues to grow at a fairly steep rate. This is good news for our dairy industry, and it does change maybe some of the things that we might think about as important on the dairy farm. So if we're looking at trying to feed a market that is going to see an increase in cheese production in the future and cheese consumption, what's important that we do on our dairy farm? Well, Cheese production is related to components, particularly fat and protein, so we need to concentrate on that on our dairy farm, and that's, for most of us, how we're actually paid for our raw milk. So I'd encourage you to visit with your nutritionist and look at ways that you can increase the component production on the dairy. This may involve increasing the amount of milk that each cow produces, but it will also probably involve a discussion of what we can do to increase the amount of protein and the amount of fat that is found in that milk so that we export a greater total pounds of protein and fat every year. And that will help drive this need that we have in the marketplace for cheese. So how about some of these other products that we might be interested in and some trends there? Well, as we look at yogurt production and yogurt consumption, it's interesting that after growing for many years, that has actually tailed off. So maybe that market has matured a little bit, which means that it's still important in our total dairy industry, but maybe not as important as we move forward. So what would be some things that we maybe should look at as far as products for the future? Well, it's interesting that butter consumption actually in the last 3 or 4 years has continued to rise and still is rising in 2016. So that might be a focus for us in some cases as well. We also see some growth in some of the other cheeses, particularly miscellaneous cheeses. Although it's a small percentage of the total butter, fat, and protein utilization here in the United States, it is still a growing market. These many times involve specialty cheeses and could be artisan cheeses as well. So for our Kansas dairy producers, what is the total message here as we look at the consumption of selected dairy products in the United States? Well, the good news is total consumption of milk and milk fat is actually up, and actually fairly dramatically in 2016. So that's a good thing. In fact, we saw increases in 2016 that we haven't seen since the early 1980s. So that's a very positive thing. Again, continue to focus on fat and protein production on your farms, because it seems to be that that is what the market is asking for. This is Mike Brouk with K-State Research and Extension.
All right, Mike, many thanks to you. Well, why does it seem that we've more deer along the roadways at this time of the year than normal? We'll get into that with K-State's Charlie Lee during his weekly segment next on Agriculture Today.
While many people know hunger is an issue in developing countries, it is also a problem in our own backyards. In 2010, 1 in 7 Kansans struggled to put adequate food on the table. 2 K-State Research and Extension programs are tackling this problem. The Family Nutrition Program and Expanded Food and Nutrition Education Program reach thousands of Kansans in more than 70 counties. They learn how to eat healthy with a low budget. For more information about these programs, visit ksre.ksu.edu.
We're back now on Agriculture Today, and this time every week set aside to talk wildlife management with K-State Research and Extension wildlife specialist Charlie Lee. Of course, it's timely, Charlie, that we bring up this topic, deer movement out in the wild, and boy, that's reaching a peak now, as it usually does this time of the year.
Yes, the peak movement for deer on roadways is mid-November. Today's program will address some of the causes of deer movement here in the Midwest. There are certainly a lot of vehicles on the roads. When I looked at the statistics, there were over 32 billion miles traveled in Kansas in 2016, with 9,648 crashes involving deer.
There are 2 types of deer movement, you say?
2 prominent types of deer movement. The first would be dispersal, and that's the process in which individuals are influenced to leave the range where they were born to establish a new, very distinct home range. Typically, it's parturition that influences dispersal. The individual continues along that path of dispersal until they find an area that fulfills all of their habitat needs. And then once those needs are met, then that individual establishes a new home range. Migration is the other type of prominent movement, and that's when an individual moves from one home range to a different home range and then returns to the original. So typically that's thought of as being a winter and summer movement. Most often that's thought of to be in the mountains, particularly with mule deer, but it also occurs in white-tailed deer here in the Midwest.
So let's look at those individually. Why are deer inclined to disperse?
Well, they move to disperse for many different reasons. One, they may have challenges in the area in which they're currently occupying. They move as a choice to improve fitness and chances of survival. Often that's moving to a higher quality habitat area where perhaps reproductive potential would be greater. Maybe they're avoiding competition from other deer when resources are limited. Perhaps they're avoiding additional predation or hassle from other outside, perhaps human-caused movements. Another suggestion is that they move and disperse to improve genetic fitness, in that keeping the most fit genes in one area is not the best survival for that individual species. So they spread those dominant genes out across the countryside with dispersal. So it's actually more of a process rather than a one-time event. And it's really a fairly complex process that involves the change of the seasons, the population dynamics of that particular deer herd, the social pressures within that local deer herd, the landscape features and landscape dynamics. And then you couple all of that with the disturbances caused by humans, and it gets pretty complex, and it's not really that well understood.
Well, distinguish then dispersal from migration and why deer are compelled to migrate.
Migration would be seasonal movements between two different home ranges. Typically, through the northern portions of the range, deer commonly migrate between summer and winter ranges, and that's often thought of as avoiding snow so that there's still forage available for consumption. But typically, migration focuses on reproductive success. If migration allows a better access to higher quality resources, deer are able to produce more or healthier young. And it's really a learned behavior, and it's established early on in deer's social development, and it's passed from one generation to the next. There's been some studies that looked at orphan deer, and they remain non-migratory because they failed to learn that behavior from their mothers. So their fitness overall is usually not as good because they may remain in areas that don't have all of the features that are required for their survival.
In either case, are we talking about significant distances traveled in dispersing or migrating?
Well, the distances traveled during dispersal really vary, from a maximum distances recorded in eastern South Dakota to about 130 miles, to dispersal distances in north central Iowa and Minnesota of over 100 miles, to some in eastern Nebraska along the Missouri River at only 50 miles. So those dispersal distances vary depending upon the region you're in, and they fluctuate depending upon what type of competition is out there for the resources and habitat availability and the landscape characteristics. When we look about distances traveled in migration, it's much smaller. Maximum migration distances by white-tailed deer are about 8 miles in Illinois, about 20 miles in Minnesota, and about 18 miles there in the study that was done in eastern Nebraska. So those migration distances are much shorter, and they often require two types of mass movement. You've got the spring and you've got the fall movement, where dispersal is a one-time movement event that occurs shortly after those young are born.
So quite some knowledge about deer movement in pocket. Does any or all of this help us predict or have a notion of times of movement, locations, and so forth?
Well, we know part of the peak cause for movement in November, when most of the vehicle accidents occur, is at the peak of deer breeding season. The males are traveling long distances hoping to find a receptive female. They're often moved from those normal areas by social pressures caused by deer with larger antlers and perhaps more mature. So young deer then are continually moving, looking for breeding partners. So that would be the key reason we see these crashes peak at this time of year. Then we see some additional movements then in the spring as dispersal begins. But typically these fall movements are a direct result of deer participating in the reproductive process.
And thus, motorists need to be on the alert for these movements.
Yes, this is a time of year for motorists to be cautious, slow down, and avoid being one of these statistics.
There's background on why deer tend to move actively, particularly at this time of the year. Charlie, we appreciate this overview. Wildlife Specialist, K-State Research and Extension. That's Charlie Lee. Our time's away for today. Thanks for tuning in. Eric Atkinson here for Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.